The cabin door rattled against the wind like bones in a coffin. Inside, Mara Whitlock pressed her back against the frozen wall, counting the hours until the cold would finally take her. She'd already made peace with it, dying alone in the Montana wilderness, just like Thomas had. But then came the knock. 3 hard strikes that shattered the silence. Her hand trembled as she reached for the rusted shotgun. Another widow had died last month, opening her door to strangers. Yet something, desperation, madness, or fate, made her fingers curl around the handle. If you stay with me until the end of this story, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city name. I want to see how far Mara's journey travels across the world. The wind screamed across the Montana territory like a wounded animal, tearing through the gaps in the cabin walls with teeth of ice. Mara Whitlock stood motionless in the center of the single room that had once been a home, watching her breath crystallize in the air before her face. Each exhale was a small ghost, a reminder that she was still breathing when perhaps she shouldn't be. The cabin had been stripped nearly bare. Where Thomas's chair had sat by the fire, there was only a dark stain on the floorboards, water damage from the leaking roof she couldn't fix alone. The table they'd carried all the way from St. Louis was gone, sold to a passing trader for enough flour to last 2 weeks. That had been a month ago. The bed frame had followed, then the iron cookware, then everything else that had any value to anyone but her. All that remained was the stone fireplace Thomas had built with his own hands, the warped floor beneath her feet, and the memories that had soaked into every plank and beam like blood into soil. She moved to the window, or what was left of it. The glass had shattered during a hailstorm in October, and she'd covered the opening with a scrap of oiled canvas that did almost nothing against the cold. Through a tear in the fabric, she could see the cemetery plot 50 yards from the house. One grave, one wooden cross already leaning sideways from the wind. Thomas Whitlock, beloved husband. 1842 to 1887. She'd carved the words herself with his hunting knife, her fingers so numb she'd barely felt the blade slip and cut her palm. The scar was still there, a thin white line across her lifeline. "I should have gone with you," she whispered to the frozen glass. The words had become a ritual, repeated so often they'd lost all meaning. I should have been there. But she hadn't been there. She'd been in town, trading their last good blanket for coffee and sugar Thomas didn't need but had asked for anyway because he knew she loved it. By the time she'd returned, the accident had already happened. The horse had already spooked. The logging chain had already snapped. Thomas had already been lying in the snow for 3 hours, his back broken, his eyes still open and searching for her. He'd died an hour after she found him, long enough to squeeze her hand, long enough to tell her to leave this place, long enough to make her promise she'd survive. She'd kept that promise for 3 months. Now she was breaking it. Mara walked to the fireplace where the last of the wood was stacked. 3 small logs, damp and half-rotted, that would burn for maybe an hour if she was lucky. The fire had gone out sometime before dawn. She couldn't remember when. Time had become strange lately, stretching and compressing without pattern. Sometimes she'd look up and realize hours had passed while she stood staring at nothing. Other times, minutes felt like days. She knelt and began arranging the kindling with fingers so stiff they barely worked. The matches were in a tin box on the mantel, only 4 left. She'd been rationing them like gold, but what was the point now? Either the fire would start, or it wouldn't. Either she'd wake up tomorrow or she wouldn't. The first match broke. The second wouldn't strike. The third caught, flared briefly, then died before the kindling could take. 1 match left. Mara stared at it lying in her palm, this tiny stick of wood and phosphorus that represented the difference between a few more hours of warmth and immediate surrender to the cold. Her hand was shaking, not from fear, but from simple physical exhaustion. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Before that, she'd been surviving on handfuls of dried beans and snow melted in a cup. "Come on," she muttered, positioning the match against the striker. "Just this once, please." The match caught. The flame danced, impossibly bright in the dim cabin. She cupped her hand around it and lowered it to the kindling, holding her breath as the small twigs began to smoke, then char, then finally, ignite. The fire spread slowly, reluctantly, as if it too had lost the will to fight, but it spread. Within minutes, flames were licking at the first log, and weak orange light was pushing back the shadows in the corners of the room. Mara sat back on her heels and watched it burn. At this rate, the wood would be gone by nightfall. Then there would be nothing left to burn except the furniture she'd already sold, the floorboard she was sitting on, or the cabin itself. She'd actually considered it last week, dismantling the walls board by board, feeding her shelter to the fire until there was nothing left but Thomas's grave and herself frozen beside it. It would be poetic, in a way, a kind of cremation, a final act of devotion. But she hadn't done it. Some stubborn part of her, the part that had survived a childhood in the Philadelphia orphanage, a marriage to a dreamer who dragged her across half a continent, and 3 months of brutal widowhood, that part refused to give in. Not yet. Not quite yet. A sound cut through the wind's howl, sharp, deliberate, impossible. 3 knocks on the door. Mara's head snapped up. For a moment, she thought she'd imagined it. The wind could play tricks, could sound like voices or footsteps or 3 more knocks. Harder this time. Her heart, which had been beating slowly for hours, suddenly hammered against her ribs. She stood on legs that threatened to buckle. Her eyes locked on the crude wooden door Thomas had hung the week before the accident. It rattled in its frame as another gust of wind hit the cabin. No one came out here. No one. The nearest neighbor was the Halverson Ranch, 7 miles south, and they'd made it clear after Thomas's death that Mara was on her own. The town was 12 miles east, impossible to reach in this weather. Traders didn't come this far north in winter. Indians kept to their own territories now, pushed back by the railroad and the army. So who, or what, was knocking? Mara's gaze fell on the shotgun leaning against the wall near the door. Thomas's gun. She'd fired it exactly twice in her life, both times at rabbits she'd missed. The weight of it in her hands was foreign and heavy, but she picked it up anyway, her fingers finding the cold metal of the trigger. "Who's there?" Her voice came out rough, barely louder than the wind. No answer, just another knock, followed by a voice, male, deep, muffled by the door and the storm. "Ma'am, I need shelter. My horse is done. I won't make it to town." Mara's grip tightened on the shotgun. She'd heard the stories every woman on the frontier had. Men who knocked on doors in storms, claiming distress, then forced their way inside. Women who'd opened their homes to strangers and paid for their kindness with blood. Martha Yates, the widow 3 valleys over, had died that way just last month, found frozen in her own bed, her cabin ransacked, her throat cut. They'd never found who did it. "I have a gun," Mara called out, "and I know how to use it." A lie. But he didn't know that. "Ma'am, I don't doubt it, but I'm asking anyway. I've got food I can share. I'm not looking for trouble, just a floor to sleep on until the storm passes." Food. The word cut through her fear like a blade. When was the last time she'd heard someone offer food instead of asking for it? "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she asked, moving closer to the door, but keeping the shotgun raised. "You don't. Same as I don't know you won't shoot me the second I step inside. But we're both going to die out here if we keep talking through this door, so one of us needs to take a chance." There was something in his voice, not desperation exactly, but a kind of exhausted practicality that Mara recognized because she heard it in her own voice now. The sound of someone who'd been pushed to the edge and found it wasn't as frightening as expected. She looked around the cabin, at the dying fire, at the empty corners where furniture used to be, at the grave visible through the window. What did she have left to lose? Her hand moved to the door's crossbar. It was frozen in place, ice having sealed it to the bracket overnight. She had to put down the shotgun to work it loose with both hands, her fingers screaming in pain as she pried at the frozen metal. The crossbar finally gave way with a crack that sounded like breaking bone. Mara grabbed the shotgun again, stepped back, and pulled the door open. The man standing on her threshold was a silhouette against the white fury of the storm, tall and broad-shouldered, covered in snow and ice. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then he stepped forward into the dim light of the cabin, and Mara saw his face. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 40, with deep lines around his eyes and mouth that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. His beard was thick and dark, crusted with ice. His eyes were gray, the color of the sky before a blizzard, and they moved around the cabin with the quick assessment of someone who'd learned to read danger in a single glance. Those eyes took in the bare walls, the meager fire, the shotgun in her hands, and finally Mara herself, thin, ragged, trembling with cold and fear, and something she couldn't name. "Thank you," he said quietly. I know what it costs to open that door. He moved past her, bringing a wave of frigid air that made the fire gutter. Behind him, visible in the brief moment before she shoved the door closed again, Mara saw a horse standing in the snow. The animal's head was down, its sides heaving, ice caked on its mane and flanks. Your horse? She started. Won't make another mile, the man finished. He was already moving toward the fire, his movements stiff. Been pushing him too hard trying to outrun the storm. Didn't work. There's a lean-to around the side of the cabin, Mara heard herself say. It's half collapsed, but it'll block some of the wind. He paused, looking at her with something that might have been surprise or respect. You sure? That's good shelter to give up for an animal. Better the horse survives than neither of you, she said. I'll need you both out of here when the storm clears. Something flickered in his expression, acknowledgement, maybe, or agreement. He nodded once and went back out into the storm. Mara stood alone in the cabin, still holding the shotgun, wondering what she'd just done. Through the canvas-covered window, she could hear him moving around outside, speaking low words to the horse. The animal's distressed whinnying faded as he led it away. She had maybe 3 minutes before he came back. 3 minutes to decide whether she'd just saved a life or invited in her own death. The door opened again, and the man stepped inside, dragging a set of saddlebags that looked impossibly heavy. He dropped them by the fire and immediately started brushing the ice from his coat with hands that moved with practiced efficiency. Name's Caleb Rourke, he said without looking at her. I run cattle on the range about 20 miles northwest of here. Was coming back from Billings when the storm hit. Mara Whitlock. She kept the shotgun pointed at him, though her arms were starting to ache from the weight. He glanced at the gun, then at her face. You planning to use that, or is it just for show? Depends on what you do next. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Fair enough. He reached for the saddlebags. Mara raised the shotgun slightly. Caleb froze, his hands visible. Easy, just getting the food I mentioned, unless you want me to starve instead of freeze. She watched as he slowly opened one of the bags and pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. The smell hit her immediately. Smoked meat, real food, not the handful of half-rotted beans she'd been living on. Her stomach clenched so hard it hurt. Elk jerky, Caleb said, unwrapping it. And I've got hardtack, some dried apples, coffee, if you've got a pot. He looked around the bare cabin, which you probably don't. I have a pot. The words came out defensive. I sold everything else, but I kept the pot. He nodded, not with pity, but with understanding. Smart. A person can survive a long time with just a pot and a fire. I wasn't trying to survive. The admission slipped out before she could stop it. I was trying to decide. Caleb's hand stilled on the food. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Decide what? Whether to stay or go, whether to burn the cabin or walk into the snow, whether there was any point to another day of this. Mara's voice was flat, emotionless. She was too tired to feel shame about the truth. And what did you decide? I decided to open the door when you knocked, so I guess I'm still deciding. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind and the crackling fire. Then Caleb held out a piece of jerky. Here, decide after you eat. Everything looks different on an empty stomach. Mara stared at the offered food. Her pride wanted to refuse it, to tell the stranger she didn't need his charity. But her body was already moving, lowering the shotgun, reaching out with a trembling hand to take the jerky. The first bite was almost painful, her mouth so dry the meat stuck to her tongue, her throat so tight she almost couldn't swallow. But the second bite was easier, and the third. By the fourth, she was eating like an animal, tearing at the smoked meat with desperate hunger she hadn't allowed herself to feel in weeks. Caleb watched her for a moment, then turned his attention to the fire, adding one of his own logs from the saddlebag. When's the last time you ate? 2 days? Maybe 3. The last time you ate a real meal? Mara stopped chewing. She couldn't remember. Before Thomas died? Or had things already been desperate by then? The money running out, the supplies dwindling? I don't know, she admitted. He grunted, a sound without judgment, and pulled out more food, arranging it on the hearth like an offering. Well, we'll fix that tonight. Storm's not letting up anytime soon. Might as well be warm and fed while we wait it out. I can't pay you for the food. Didn't ask you to. Then why are you giving it to me? Caleb looked at her again with those storm gray eyes. Because I've been where you are. Not the same circumstances, but the same place. And someone kept me fed when I couldn't do it myself. I'm just passing it on. There was a story there, Mara could tell. Loss and survival carved into his face as clearly as her own, but she was too exhausted to ask, and he didn't offer. Instead, he turned his focus to the practical matters of survival. He had Mara show him what was left of her supplies, pathetically little, and combined them with his own to create something that looked almost like a meal. He had a small pot that fit inside a larger one, creating a makeshift double boiler. Soon, the cabin was filled with the smell of coffee, real coffee, the first Mara had tasted since Thomas had asked for it that terrible day. They ate in silence, sitting on opposite sides of the fire. Mara on the floor with her back against the wall, Caleb cross-legged on the bare boards, both of them focused on the simple act of staying alive for another few hours. As the cabin slowly warmed, as much as it could with gaps in the walls and a roof that leaked snow, Mara felt something inside her thaw as well. Not hope, exactly, but a tiny ember of possibility that maybe, just maybe, the decision to open the door hadn't been entirely insane. The grave outside, Caleb said quietly, breaking the long silence. That your husband? Mara nodded, not trusting her voice. How long? 3 months. Logging accident. I'm sorry. The words should have meant nothing. She'd heard them 100 times from people who weren't sorry at all, just uncomfortable. But coming from this man delivered in that rough, honest voice, they settled into her chest like something real. He made me promise to leave, she said, staring into the fire. To go back east, to my sister in Philadelphia. To not try to keep the claim going alone. But you stayed. I stayed. She looked up at Caleb. Do you think that makes me a fool? He took a long time to answer, sipping his coffee, his eyes distant. I think, he finally said, that grief makes us do things that don't make sense to anyone else. And I think a person has a right to mourn in whatever way they need to, even if it's dangerous, even if it's killing them. You sound like you know something about that. I do. He didn't elaborate, and Mara didn't push. The storm howled on outside, shaking the cabin with gusts that threatened to tear the roof off. But inside, the fire burned steady now, fed by Caleb's logs. The warmth was almost shocking after so many days of cold. Mara felt it seeping into her bones, relaxing muscles that had been clenched tight for months. You need to sleep, Caleb said, watching her eyes start to droop. When's the last time you slept more than an hour or two? I don't know. That's what I thought. He stood and moved to the corner where his bedroll was stored in the saddlebags. Take this. I'll keep the fire going. I'm not taking your bed. It's not my bed. It's a bedroll, and you need it more than I do. Besides, someone needs to stay awake and make sure the fire doesn't go out. Might as well be me. Mara wanted to argue, but she was so tired the words wouldn't form. When Caleb laid out of the bedroll near the fire and gestured to it, she found herself moving toward it like a sleepwalker. The blankets smelled like smoke and horses and the outdoors, nothing like Thomas's scent, which had faded from her own blankets months ago. But they were warm, and that was enough. If you try anything, she started, her hand still near the shotgun. I won't, Caleb interrupted. I've got a daughter about your age. If she was alone in a cabin like this, I'd hope someone would give her a warm place to sleep without making her afraid. It was the first personal thing he'd shared beyond his name. Mara filed it away, something to think about when her mind was clearer. She lay down on the bedroll, and the simple act of being horizontal, of being warm, of having food in her stomach, overwhelmed her completely. Her eyes closed. Thank you, she whispered. She didn't hear if he responded. Sleep took her like a stone dropped into dark water, pulling her down into depths she hadn't visited in months. Real sleep, not the fitful half-conscious state she'd been existing in. Caleb Rourke sat by the fire and watched the woman sleep, his expression unreadable. Outside, the storm raged on, burying the Montana frontier under fresh snow. Inside, two strangers shared warmth and silence and the fragile, dangerous thing called trust. The fire crackled, the wind screamed, and Mara Whitlock slept through the night for the first time since her husband died, while a man she didn't know kept watch over her life. When she woke, everything would be different. But for now, there was only this: the warmth, the darkness, the sound of someone else breathing in the room. For now, that was enough. Mara woke to the sound of hammering. For a disoriented moment, she thought Thomas was still alive, working on one of his endless repair projects that never quite got finished. Then reality crashed back. The empty cabin, the grave outside, the 3 months of slow dying she'd been doing alone. Except, she wasn't alone. She sat up quickly, her hand reaching instinctively for the shotgun that wasn't there. Panic flared until she saw it leaning against the wall where she'd left it, untouched. The fire was burning strong, fed with fresh wood. Caleb's saddlebags were still by the hearth, but the man himself was nowhere in the cabin. The hammering came again, muffled by the walls. Outside. Mara stood on legs that felt stronger than they had in weeks. The sleep and food had done their work. Through the canvas-covered window, she could see daylight. Not the bright white of a blizzard, but the softer gray of heavy clouds. The storm had passed sometime during the night. She moved to the door and pulled it open. The cold hit her like a fist, but it was different now, cleaner, less vicious. The wind had died to occasional gusts instead of the constant roar. Snow lay thick across everything, smoothing the harsh landscape into gentle curves. And there was Caleb Rourke, standing on a ladder propped against the side of her cabin, hammering a board across a gap in the wall she'd stopped noticing months ago. He heard the door and looked down, hammer still raised. "Morning. Coffee's still hot if you want it." Mara stared at him, then at the ladder, then at the pile of boards stacked in the snow beside the cabin. Boards that hadn't been there yesterday. "What are you doing?" "Fixing the holes in your walls. Figured if you're going to survive out here, you need a cabin that doesn't leak heat like a sieve." He drove another nail home with 3 efficient strikes. "Found these boards in what's left of your shed. You weren't using them." "Those are mine." "I know. That's why I'm using them on your cabin instead of mine." He climbed down the ladder and picked up another board, examining it for straightness. "You got a problem with that?" "Yes," Mara wanted to say. She had a problem with charity, with debt, with owing anyone anything when she had nothing to give back. But the words stuck in her throat because the truth was more complicated. "I didn't ask you to do this," she said instead. "No, you didn't." Caleb positioned the new board against the wall, marking where it needed to be cut. "But I'm doing it anyway. You can thank me or curse me, makes no difference. Either way, you'll be warmer tonight." He went back to work, and Mara stood in the doorway, wrapped in the blanket from his bedroll, watching him. He moved with the easy competence of someone who'd spent a lifetime building and fixing things. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Just steady work that slowly transformed the broken cabin wall into something solid. "Your horse," she said after a while. "Is it alive? Sore, but alive. Gave him some grain for my supplies. He'll be ready to ride in a day or 2. Caleb paused in his hammering. "Storm's passed, but there's more coming. I can feel it. You got maybe 48 hours before the next one hits." The implication was clear, 48 hours for him to leave. 48 hours for her to decide what came next. Mara went back inside and poured herself coffee from the pot Caleb had left by the fire. It was strong and hot and tasted like the best thing she'd ever drunk. She stood by the fire, sipping it slowly, listening to the rhythm of the hammer outside. She should tell him to stop. Should tell him she didn't need his help, didn't want his pity, would be fine on her own once he left. But the lies wouldn't come. She was so tired of lying, even to herself. The hammering continued for the next 2 hours. Mara busied herself with small tasks, sweeping the floor, organizing what little she had left, trying to create order in a life that had lost all structure. Every so often, she'd glance out the window and see Caleb working, methodical and focused, fixing a cabin that wasn't his for a woman he didn't know. Around midday, he came back inside, his face red from the cold, ice crystals clinging to his beard. "That's the worst of it," he said, warming his hands by the fire. "Patched 5 holes in the north wall and reinforced the corner where the logs were coming apart. Won't hold forever, but it'll get you through the winter if you keep the fire going." "If," Mara repeated. "You mean if I don't walk into the snow and lie down?" Caleb looked at her sharply. "That what you're planning?" "I don't know what I'm planning. I haven't known what I'm planning since Thomas died." He was quiet for a moment, then pulled out the food supplies again. Sit down. We're going to eat and we're going to talk. Real talk, not this dancing around the truth we've been doing. Mara wanted to refuse, but her stomach had other ideas. She sat across from him as he assembled another meal. More jerky, some hardtack he softened in hot water, a handful of dried apples that tasted like heaven. They ate in silence at first, but it was a different kind of silence than the night before. Less guarded, more comfortable. The silence of two people who'd survived something together, even if that something was just a storm. "Tell me about him," Caleb said finally. "Your husband." "Why?" "Because if you're thinking about following him into the ground, I should at least know who he was." Mara's first instinct was to refuse. Her grief was private, sacred, not something to share with a stranger. But then again, what did privacy matter now? What did any of it matter? "Thomas was a dreamer," she began, her voice soft. "That's what drew me to him in the first place. He saw possibility everywhere, in a piece of land, in a business venture, in the West. He convinced me that Montana was our future, that we could build something here that would last." "But," Caleb prompted when she paused, "but dreams don't keep you warm. Dreams don't fix a roof, or hunt food, or survive a winter." Thomas was always planning the next thing, the better thing, while the current thing fell apart around us. She looked into the fire. "I loved him anyway. Even when I was angry at him, I loved him." "What happened? The accident?" Mara's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "He was trying to move logs by himself. I told him to wait, to hire help from town, but he said we couldn't afford it. The chain snapped. One of the logs rolled onto him." Her voice went flat. "It took him 3 hours to die. I held his hand the whole time." Caleb's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Recognition. Understanding. "My wife died in childbirth," he said quietly. 8 years ago. The baby with her. I was out on the range, didn't even know she'd gone into labor until a neighbor rode out to find me. By the time I got back, he stopped, shook his head. 3 hours, you said. I had 3 minutes, just long enough to hear her say my name once." The confession hung between them, raw and painful. Mara felt something crack open in her chest. Not sympathy exactly, but kinship. The bone-deep knowledge that this man understood what she carried. "You said you have a daughter," she said. "Had. Not from that marriage, from before, when I was young and stupid and thought I knew everything. Her mother and I never married. I send money when I can, but I haven't seen her in 6 years. Don't even know if she'd recognize me now." "Why not?" Caleb stood abruptly, moving to add wood to the fire. "Because after Eleanor died, I couldn't stand to be around anything that reminded me of family, of the life I was supposed to have. So I left. Ran cattle in the middle of nowhere, saw people maybe twice a year, lived like I was the only man left in the world." He turned to face her. "That work for you? That answer your question about why I understand what you're doing out here?" Mara met his gaze steadily. "You're still alive, though, still running your ranch, still surviving." "Am I?" His laugh was bitter. "Or am I just doing what you're doing, but slower, taking 20 years to die instead of 3 months?" The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward. They stared at each other across the fire, two people who'd been circling death for so long they'd forgotten what living looked like. "I don't know how to do this," Mara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to keep going when everything I was working toward is gone. The life Thomas and I planned, the future we were building, it all died with him. What's left?" "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "I've been asking myself the same question for 8 years. Have you found an answer?" "No, but I'm still here asking it. That's got to count for something." Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the newly repaired walls. But the sound was different now, less like the cabin was about to collapse, more like it was holding firm against the assault. Small progress, but progress nonetheless. Mara stood and moved to the window, looking out at Thomas's grave. The snow had drifted against the cross, almost burying it. In a few more days, it would be invisible, completely covered until spring. "He told me to leave," she said. "With his last breath, he made me promise I'd go back east, start over, find some kind of life that didn't include this place. And I meant to. I really did. But then I buried him, and I couldn't move. Couldn't think about anything except that if I left, I'd be abandoning him, like he died for nothing. He didn't die for nothing. He died in an accident. I know that in my head, but my heart... She pressed her palm against her chest. My heart says I should have been able to save him, should have been there sooner, should have made him wait for help, should have done something different. Caleb came to stand beside her at the window. My head tells me Eleanor's death wasn't my fault, that childbirth is dangerous, that women die from it all the time, that I couldn't have done anything even if I'd been there. My heart doesn't believe a word of it. They stood shoulder to shoulder, two people carrying the weight of the dead, staring out at a landscape that didn't care whether they lived or died. What do we do? Mara asked. People like us? We survive. Or we don't. There's no middle ground. Caleb turned to face her. But if we're going to survive, we've got to do more than just breathe. We've got to decide that we want to. And if I don't know if I want to, then you keep deciding one day at a time until eventually you do. Mara laughed, a short, sharp sound without humor. That sounds exhausting. It is, but it beats the alternative. The rest of the day passed in a strange kind of companionship. Caleb continued his repairs, moving from the walls to the roof where he could reach without too much risk. Mara actually cooked, using real ingredients from Caleb's supplies combined with the pitiful remains of her own. Beans with a bit of bacon, cornbread made from precious flour, coffee that flowed freely because for once there was enough. As the afternoon light began to fade, Caleb came back inside and surveyed the cabin with a critical eye. You need furniture, he said bluntly. Can't keep sleeping on the floor. I sold the furniture. I know, but winter's not over. You'll need at least a chair, maybe a crate for storage. I saw some scraps of wood out in the shed that could work. I can't keep taking from you. You're not taking, I'm offering. There's a difference. He was already moving toward the door. Besides, I need something to do. Sitting still makes me think too much. Before she could protest, he was gone again, out into the gathering darkness. Mara heard him rummaging through the wreckage of the shed, the sound of wood being shifted and sorted. She sat by the fire and wondered when the last time was that someone had simply done something for her without expecting payment or gratitude or anything in return. Even Thomas, as much as she'd loved him, had always needed something, her approval, her support, her belief in his dreams. Caleb asked for nothing, just worked, steady and silent, fixing a life that wasn't his. He returned an hour later dragging rough-cut boards and an assortment of bent nails he'd straightened. Without a word, he began constructing a simple chair, nothing fancy, just 4 legs and a seat, but built solid enough to last. You know carpentry, Mara observed, watching him work. Ranching doesn't pay the bills when you're starting out. I did odd jobs for the first 5 years, building, fence work, anything that needed hands. Learned real quick that good work brings more work. He drove a nail home. Still comes in handy when something breaks? Everything breaks eventually. True enough. But most things can be fixed if you're willing to put in the effort. Mara heard the double meaning and chose not to acknowledge it. Instead, she asked, Where's your ranch? You said northwest of here. About a day's ride in good weather. 3 days in this. He tested the chair's stability, then nodded in satisfaction. Got about 200 head of cattle, a decent cabin, a barn that's seen better days. It's not much, but it's mine. You run it alone? Got 2 hands who help during spring and fall. Rest of the year it's just me. Sounds lonely. Caleb met her eyes. It is. But lonely's easier than trying to be around people who don't understand. Easier than pretending you're fine when you're not. Is that what you've been doing? Pretending? Every day for 8 years. He moved to start on a second chair. Gets easier with practice, but it never stops being a lie. They worked in silence. Caleb building, Mara preparing another meal from dwindling supplies. The fire crackled, the wind blew. And in the small circle of light and warmth, 2 broken people existed together, without judgment or expectation. As night fell, they ate together again. The conversation came easier now, drifting from the practical to the personal, and back again. Caleb talked about his ranch, the challenges of keeping cattle alive through Montana winters, the satisfaction of seeing a calf born healthy after a difficult pregnancy. Mara talked about Philadelphia, the orphanage where she'd grown up, the sister she hadn't written to in over a year. You should write to her, Caleb said. Let her know you're alive. What would I say? That I'm half starved in a falling down cabin, too stubborn to leave my dead husband's grave? That'd go over real well. You'd be surprised what people want to hear. Most folks just want to know their loved ones are still breathing, even if everything else is wrong. Mara thought about her sister Rebecca, practical, sensible Rebecca, who'd begged her not to go west, who'd said Thomas was a fool and Mara was a bigger one for following him. Rebecca who'd probably written her off as dead months ago. Maybe, she said noncommittally. The second day of Caleb's presence passed much like the first, work and food and conversation that slowly peeled back layers of isolation. He finished the 2 chairs and started on a small table, fixed the door so it closed properly, cleared snow from around the cabin to reduce drafts, made the space functional again, habitable. Mara found herself helping without quite meaning to, holding boards while he nailed, fetching tools, making suggestions. It felt strange, working alongside someone again. She'd forgotten what it was like to have another set of hands, another mind solving problems. That evening, as they sat by the fire in the new chairs eating a stew Caleb had made from salt pork and dried vegetables, he finally said what she'd been waiting for him to say. Storm's coming tomorrow night. I need to leave before it hits. Mara's stomach dropped, though she'd known this was coming. Back to your ranch. Yeah, can't leave the cattle too long, and the hands will be worried if I don't show up soon. Right, of course. She stared into her bowl. You've been more than generous. I'll be fine. Will you? The question hung heavy. Mara wanted to lie, to assure him she'd be perfectly fine alone again, but the words wouldn't come. They'd been too honest with each other for lies to work now. I don't know, she admitted. Caleb set down his bowl and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. I have a proposition, and I want you to hear me out before you say no. Mara's heart started pounding. What kind of proposition? Come with me. To my ranch. He spoke quickly, as if afraid she'd interrupt. I've got a cabin twice the size of this one, plenty of food, a good stove. You could have your own space, your own room. I'm not asking... He stopped, choosing his words carefully. I'm not asking for anything improper. You'd be a hired hand, same as any other. Help with cooking, mending, maybe the books since you can read and write. In return, you'd have shelter and food and a chance to get through the winter without freezing or starving. Mara stared at him, her mind racing. You want me to work for you? I want you to survive. The work's just the excuse. People will talk. Let them. We're 20 miles from the nearest neighbor. No one will even know you're there unless you want them to. I can't leave Thomas. The words came out desperate, panicked. Caleb's expression softened. You're not leaving him. You're choosing to keep living. There's a difference. Is there? Mara stood abruptly, needing to move. He's buried 50 yards from this cabin. If I leave, I'm abandoning him to the snow and the coyotes and the emptiness. I'm breaking my promise. What promise? That I'd be here. That I'd stay. That his sacrifice meant something. Caleb stood too, his voice gentle but firm. Thomas didn't sacrifice himself. He had an accident. And staying here, dying slowly of starvation and cold, that doesn't honor his memory. It just wastes the life you still have. Maybe I don't want this life. Maybe I want the one I was supposed to have, the one where he didn't die, where we made the ranch work, where I wasn't so damned alone all the time. Her voice cracked. Maybe I'm tired of choosing to survive when survival is all I've got. I know, but Caleb didn't move toward her, didn't try to comfort her, just stood there, solid and real. I know exactly how that feels. But here's what I learned in 8 years of living like a ghost. You can't bring them back. All you can do is decide whether their death destroys you too, or whether you find a way to keep going. And which did you choose? I'm still deciding. Every single day I'm still deciding. He paused. But I think I'd like to decide somewhere with another person around. Someone who understands. Someone who's fighting the same fight. Mara turned to look at him fully. In the firelight, his weathered face looked both hard and vulnerable. A man who'd survived everything except his own heart. This is insane, she said. I don't know you. You don't know me. We've spent 2 days together. True, but we've been honest with each other, which is more than most people manage in a lifetime. And right now, honest is what we both need. What if I say yes and then can't do it? can't leave, can't work, can't be around another person. Then you tell me. And we figure something else out. Nothing's permanent except death, and we've both had enough of that. Mara looked out the window at Thomas's grave, barely visible now in the darkness. She thought about spending another night alone, another week, another month. Thought about the slow fade into nothing that waited if she stayed. I need time to think, she said. You've got until morning. Storm will hit tomorrow night. If you're coming, we leave at first light. He didn't push further. Just banked the fire, laid out his bedroll on one side of the cabin, and gestured for her to take the other. They settled into sleep like they'd done it 100 times before, the silence between them comfortable now. But Mara didn't sleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to Caleb's steady breathing, her mind churning through possibilities and fears and the terrible, terrifying question of what came next. By the time dawn broke, pale and cold through the window, she'd made her decision. She rose quietly, dressed in the warmest clothes she had left, and stepped outside into the freezing air. The snow crunched under her boots as she walked to Thomas's grave. The cross was still there, still leaning, the words she'd carved almost invisible under frost and ice. She knelt beside it, her hand pressing against the frozen ground. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Thomas, but I can't stay here. I can't die for you when you asked me to live." The wind picked up, blowing snow across the grave. No answer came, no sign, just the endless silence of the dead. Mara stayed there for a long time, saying goodbye to the man she'd loved, to the life they'd tried to build, to the woman she'd been before loss had carved her hollow. Then she stood, brushed the snow from her knees, and walked back to the cabin. Caleb was awake, packing his saddlebags. He looked up when she entered, his expression neutral, waiting. "I'll come with you," Mara said, "but I need to take something with me." "What?" She moved to the corner where she'd hidden Thomas's few possessions, his knife, his watch, a photograph of them on their wedding day. She wrapped them carefully in a cloth and tucked them into the small bag that held everything she owned now. "I'm ready," she said. Caleb nodded once, no triumph in his expression, just acknowledgement. "Then let's go. We've got a hard ride ahead." They loaded his horse together, tying down supplies and bedrolls. The cabin stood empty behind them, already looking abandoned, as if Mara had never been there at all. She took one last look at Thomas's grave, committing it to memory, then turned her back on it and climbed onto the horse behind Caleb. As they rode away from the cabin, the first flakes of the new storm began to fall. Mara didn't look back. Looking back would break her, and she'd already been broken enough. Instead, she focused on the solid warmth of the man in front of her, the horse steady beneath them, and the uncertain future that waited somewhere in the frozen distance. For the first time in 3 months, she was choosing life. It terrified her. But Caleb was right. Terrified and breathing was better than the alternative. The snow fell harder, erasing their tracks, burying the cabin and the grave and everything Mara had been before. And as they rode into the whiteness, two people who'd been dying in different ways rode toward something that wasn't quite hope, but might become it if they survived long enough. The ride to Caleb's ranch took 3 days instead of 1. The storm that had been threatening arrived with savage force on the first night, forcing them to take shelter in a shallow cave that barely deserved the name. Caleb built a fire at the entrance while Mara huddled against the back wall, wrapped in both their blankets, listening to the wind shriek like something alive and furious. They didn't speak much that first night. There was nothing to say that the storm wouldn't swallow, and besides, Mara was too consumed with the enormity of what she'd done to form coherent words. Every mile they'd traveled felt like a betrayal, even as she knew staying would have been suicide. The second day brought clearer skies but brutal cold. They rode double on Caleb's horse, Mara's arms wrapped around his waist, more for warmth than balance. She could feel every breath he took, the steady rhythm of a body that had learned to endure. Her own breath came shallower, her lungs burning from the frozen air. "You still with me?" Caleb called back over his shoulder around midday. "Where else would I be?" The words came out sharper than she intended, brittle with exhaustion and grief she couldn't process while trying not to freeze to death. "Fair point." He didn't take offense. "We'll stop soon. There's a line shack about an hour ahead if the markers are still standing." The line shack turned out to be barely more substantial than the cave. 4 walls, a roof with holes, a rusted stove, that took an hour to coax into producing heat. But it was shelter, and after another night in the elements, Mara had learned not to be particular about accommodations. They shared another meal of jerky and hardtack, eating mechanically, feeding their bodies because staying alive required it. Mara's hands shook as she ate, whether from cold or delayed shock, she couldn't tell. "Regret it yet?" Caleb asked, watching her struggle to hold the tin cup of coffee he'd made. "I've been regretting it since we left." Mara took a sip, letting the heat spread through her chest. "But I'd regret staying more, so here we are." "That's honest, at least." "I don't have the energy to lie anymore. Used it all up pretending I was fine for 3 months." Caleb nodded, prodding the fire with a stick. "When we get to the ranch tomorrow, there'll be 2 men there. Ben Cartwright and James Two Horses. They're good hands. Don't ask questions, keep to themselves mostly. But they'll wonder about you." "What will you tell them?" "The truth. That you needed work and I needed help. Anything beyond that is our business, not theirs." Mara considered this. "And if they don't believe you?" "Then they can find work elsewhere. My ranch, my rules." He said it simply, without bravado, statement of fact. She studied him across the fire. This man who'd appeared in her life like some kind of miracle or curse she couldn't quite determine. "Why are you doing this? Really? You could have just kept writing when you saw my cabin." Caleb was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. "Because 8 years ago, I was where you are now. Standing on the edge, trying to decide if there was any point to another day. And nobody came. Nobody knocked on my door. Nobody offered me a way out. I survived because I was too stubborn to die, but it was close. Real close." He looked up at her. "So when I saw that cabin, saw the grave, saw you, I couldn't ride past. Couldn't be the person who had a chance to help and didn't take it. You're trying to save me." "No, I'm trying to give you the same choice I wish someone had given me. A different path than the one that ends with you frozen in the snow. What you do with that choice is up to you." Mara wrapped her hands tighter around the cup. "What if I can't do this? What if I get to your ranch and I'm useless? I don't know anything about cattle or ranching or... You know how to survive. That's enough to start." Caleb stood, adding more wood to the fire. "Rest of it, you'll learn, or you won't. But you'll be alive to try, and that's better than the alternative." They slept in shifts that night, taking turns keeping the fire going and watching for wolves that never came. When Mara woke for her second shift around 3 in the morning, she found Caleb already awake, staring out the broken window at the star-filled sky. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked quietly. "Never can on the trail. Too many years sleeping alone, I guess. Body doesn't trust sleep when there's someone else around." Mara understood that. She'd barely slept either, hyper-aware of another person breathing in the small space, half expecting to wake up and find it had all been a fever dream. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, needing to fill the silence with something other than her own thoughts. "What's it like?" Caleb's expression softened slightly. "Main cabin's got 2 rooms, a common area with the kitchen, and a bedroom I use for storage now. There's a loft where the hands sleep when they're staying over. Barn's solid, built it myself the first year. Corrals need work, but they hold. Got a smokehouse, a root cellar, a chicken coop that's mostly empty because coyotes keep getting in." He paused. "It's not fancy, but it's functional. Keeps the wind out, keeps the heat in. That's all that matters out here." "Where would I stay?" "Main cabin. You'd have the bedroom, I'd sleep in the common area. Door locks from the inside if that makes you feel safer." The casual way he said it, acknowledging her fear without making her feel weak for having it, loosened something in Mara's chest. "And the work?" "Cooking mostly, at first. Ben and James can barely boil water without burning it. Mending, maybe some cleaning. Once spring comes, there'll be garden work if you want it. Helping with calving, keeping the books organized. I'm not asking you to break horses or rope cattle. What if I want to learn?" Caleb looked at her with something like surprise. "Then I'll teach you, or the hands will. But you don't have to prove anything, Mara. Just being there, being alive, that's enough." The third day dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline winter morning that made the whole world look like it was made of glass. They rode in companionable silence now, the awkwardness of strangers beginning to ease into something more comfortable. Around noon, Caleb pointed to a line of cottonwoods in the distance. That's my property line. Another hour and we'll be there. Mara's stomach clenched with anxiety. For 3 days, she'd been in transit, suspended between her old life and whatever came next. Now the uncertainty was about to become real. The ranch appeared gradually. First the barn, a solid structure that spoke of careful construction, then the corrals with cattle dotting the snow-covered fields, then the cabin itself. It was larger than Mara's had been, built from darker logs that had weathered to a deep gray. Smoke rose from the chimney. 2 men emerged from the barn as they approached. The first was lean and weathered, probably in his 50s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same rock as the mountains. The second was younger, maybe 30, with dark skin and black hair worn in a single braid down his back. Both men's expressions went carefully neutral when they saw Mara. "Ben! James!" Caleb called out, dismounting and helping Mara down. Her legs nearly buckled after 3 days on horseback, and she had to grab his arm to keep from falling. "This is Mara Whitlock. She'll be helping around the place for the winter. Mara, this is Ben Cartwright and James' 2 horses." Ben touched his hat brim. "Ma'am?" James just nodded, his dark eyes missing nothing. Not Mara's threadbare clothes, not the way she swayed on her feet, not the desperate edge she could feel radiating from her like heat. "Get settled in the cabin," Caleb said to Mara. "I need to check on the cattle with the boys, make sure nothing died while I was gone. We'll talk about the work schedule tonight." He was giving her space, Mara realized. Time to adjust without him watching. She nodded gratefully and headed for the cabin. Inside, it was warmer than anywhere she'd been in months. A good stove dominated one wall, radiating heat that made her skin prickle. The common room held a table with 4 chairs, a pair of worn armchairs near the stove, shelves lined with supplies and equipment. Everything was functional, neat, utterly without decoration or warmth. A bachelor's space. The bedroom was through a door on the left. Mara pushed it open and found a narrow bed with a real mattress, a trunk, a small table, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. The room smelled musty from disuse, but it was dry and solid and private. She sat on the bed and put her face in her hands. For the first time since leaving her cabin, she let herself cry. Not the desperate, gasping sobs of early grief, but something quieter and deeper, mourning for the life she'd left behind, terror at the one stretching ahead, exhaustion from simply trying to keep breathing day after day. She cried until there was nothing left, then lay back on the mattress and stared at the ceiling. Through the window, she could hear the men's voices as they worked, the lowing of cattle, the ordinary sounds of a working ranch. It felt surreal, like she'd stepped into someone else's life. Maybe she had. When Caleb returned an hour later, he found her in the kitchen, already sorting through supplies and trying to figure out what could be made into a decent meal. "You don't have to start working right away," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "Give yourself time to settle." "I'd rather be useful." Mar held up a sack of beans. "These are half rotten, and your flour's got weevils. When's the last time anyone organized this kitchen?" "Probably never. We just grab what we need and hope for the best." That explains why everything's a disaster. She was already pulling supplies off shelves, examining each item, making mental notes. It felt good to have a task, something concrete to focus on instead of the chaos in her head. Caleb watched her for a moment, then moved to help. "Ben and James eat with us when they're here. Usually that's every night. Sometimes they stay over in the loft, if weather's bad, or we've got early work. That okay with you? It's your house. It's your workplace now, too. If you're not comfortable eating with them, we'll work something else out." Mara paused, a jar of preserves in her hands. "I'm not delicate, Caleb. I survived 3 months alone in a falling down cabin. I can handle eating dinner with your ranch hands." "Fair enough." He pulled out a crate of potatoes. "But if that changes, you tell me. Part of the deal is that you feel safe here." That night, Mara cooked her first meal at the ranch, beans and bacon with cornbread, simple but substantial. Ben and James came in from the barn, cleaned up, and sat at the table with the wary politeness of men unsure how to act around a woman. They ate in near silence at first, just the sound of utensils on plates and the occasional request to pass something. Then Ben cleared his throat. "This is real good, ma'am. Best meal we've had in months." "It's just beans," Mara said, uncomfortable with the praise. "Yeah, but they're not burned, and they've got flavor. That's more than we usually manage." He glanced at Caleb. No offense, boss. None taken. My cooking's terrible, and we all know it. James spoke for the first time, his voice quiet. You know how to make fry bread? Mara shook her head. I've never tried. I'll teach you if you want, my grandmother's recipe. Better than cornbread. It was an olive branch, carefully extended. Mara accepted it. I'd like that. The tension at the table eased slightly. Conversation began to flow, talk about the cattle, weather predictions, plans for spring. The men included Mara peripherally, not making a big show of it, just acknowledging her presence. After dinner, Ben and James returned to the barn to check on a cow that was showing signs of early labor. Caleb and Mara cleaned it up together, falling into an easy rhythm. She washed, he dried, both of them moving around the small kitchen like they'd done this 100 times before. They seem like good men, Mara said, scrubbing a pot. They are. Ben's been with me 5 years, James for 3. I trust them with my life. Caleb paused. They'll respect your privacy, but they're going to be curious. Men talk, even when they try not to. Let them talk. I've got nothing to hide. She handed him the pot. Well, nothing except the fact that I was half dead when you found me, but I'm guessing they've already figured that out. Probably. Ben's got sharp eyes. They finished the dishes in silence. When everything was clean and put away, Mara felt the exhaustion of the past 3 days crash over her like a wave. I need to sleep, she said. Real sleep. In a real bed. Take the bedroom. I'll be out here if you need anything. Mara hesitated at the door. Caleb, thank you for all of this. I know I haven't said it enough, but you don't need to thank me. Just survive. That's payment enough. She nodded and went into the bedroom, closing the door and sliding the bolt home. The lock was solid. Reassuring, she undressed to her shift, climbed under the blankets, and let the warmth and darkness take her. The next few weeks fell into a pattern. Mara rose early, made a breakfast for the men, spent her days organizing the kitchen, mending clothes, learning the rhythms of the ranch. The work was hard but straightforward, and she threw herself into it with desperate focus. Caleb was careful with her, maintaining professional distance while still being present. He showed her where supplies were kept, explained the ranch's routines, answered her questions without making her feel stupid for asking. Ben and James followed his lead, treating her with quiet respect. But beneath the routine, Mara felt herself fracturing. At night, alone in the bedroom, she'd lie awake thinking about Thomas, about the grave she'd left behind, about the promises she'd broken. Guilt ate at her like acid. During the day, she'd catch herself looking out the window toward the southeast, toward the cabin and the cemetery plot, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. Caleb noticed. He said nothing at first, but she could feel his attention, the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. It came to a head 3 weeks after her arrival. Mara was in the kitchen making bread when her hands started shaking so badly she couldn't knead the dough. The shaking spread to her whole body, and suddenly she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except stand there falling apart. Caleb found her like that, braced against the counter, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Mara? His voice cut through the panic. Look at me. She couldn't. Her vision was graying at the edges. Mara, you're safe. You're not dying. This is just fear. Breathe with me. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. He demonstrated, his breathing slow and deliberate. Mara tried to match it, failed, tried again. Slowly, agonizingly, her lungs began to work properly again. The shaking eased. The world came back into focus. What happened? Caleb asked when she could stand without support. I don't know. I was just making bread and then She stopped, shook her head. I can't do this. I thought I could, but I can't. I should never have left. Thomas is alone out there, and I'm here making bread like nothing's wrong, like I didn't abandon him. Stop. Caleb's voice was firm but not harsh. You didn't abandon him. He's dead, Mara. He doesn't know you left. But I know. I promised to stay and I didn't. I know I'm here living while he's rotting in the ground. I know. Her voice broke. I know I'm a coward for running away. You're not a coward. You're a survivor. There's a difference. Is there? Because right now it feels the same. Caleb pulled out a chair and gestured for her to sit. She did, her legs too weak to hold her anymore. He sat across from her, his hands folded on the table. I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone. he said quietly. After Eleanor died, I tried to follow her. Stood on a cliff with a loaded gun, fully intending to pull the trigger. Figured if she was gone, there was no point to me being here. Mara's breath caught. What stopped you? A coyote. Stupid thing wandered right up to me, bold as brass, looking for food probably. And I remember thinking, this animal's just trying to survive. It doesn't care about my grief or my pain. It's just living because that's what living things do. He shook his head. Sounds crazy, but that coyote saved my life. Made me realize that survival doesn't have to have a reason. Sometimes it's enough just to keep breathing until you find one. And did you find a reason? Not really, but I found a routine. Work that needed doing, animals that needed tending, land that didn't care about my feelings. And somehow that was enough. Mara stared at the bread dough, half kneaded and abandoned. What if it's not enough for me? Then we'll find something that is. But you have to give it time, Mara. You can't expect 3 weeks to undo 3 months of dying. I'm trying. I know you are, and you're doing better than you think. He gestured around the kitchen. This place was a disaster when you got here. Now it's organized, clean, functional. The men are eating real meals instead of half-burned slop. That's not nothing. It's just survival. You said so yourself. Survival is the foundation everything else gets built on. You survive first, then you figure out how to live. Can't skip steps. Mara wanted to argue, but she was too exhausted. Instead, she finished the bread in silence while Caleb sat with her, not helping, just being present. When the loaves were in the oven, she turned to him. Does it get easier? I don't know. It's been 8 years and I'm still waiting to find out. He stood, pushing his chair back. But I'm still here. That's got to count for something. After he left, Mara sat alone in the warm kitchen, listening to the fire crackle and the bread bake. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing, men working, the wind moving through the cottonwoods. It wasn't home. It wasn't the life she'd planned. But it was warm and solid and real, and for now, that would have to be enough. As winter deepened, Mara began to find her place in the ranch's ecosystem. She learned James's fry bread recipe, taught Ben how to mend his shirts properly, organized the supply shed so thoroughly that Caleb could find things for the first time in years. Small victories, but they added up. She also began to venture outside more, first just to the chicken coop and root cellar, then to the barn to watch the men work with the cattle. James showed her how to approach a nervous cow, how to read an animal's body language. Ben taught her to recognize the signs of illness or injury. One particularly cold afternoon, Mara found herself in the barn helping Caleb repair a broken stall gate. He worked steadily, and she handed him tools, held boards in place, learned by watching. You're good at this, she observed. Building, I mean. Had a lot of practice. Ranch doesn't maintain itself. Did you build all of this? The barn? The cabin? Most of it. Hired help for the heavy framing, but the rest I did myself over the years. He hammered in a nail with 3 precise strikes. Gives you something to focus on when your mind won't settle. Mara understood that. Work had become her refuge too, the thing that kept the darkness at bay. Caleb, she said slowly, what happens when spring comes? He paused, the hammer in his hand. What do you mean? I mean, this arrangement, it's for the winter, right? To help me survive until the weather breaks, but then what? Do I leave, stay, go back? She couldn't finish the sentence. Caleb set down the hammer and looked at her directly. That's up to you. If you want to leave in the spring, I won't stop you. If you want to stay and keep working, you're welcome to. And if you want to go back to your cabin, he stopped, chose his words carefully. I won't lie and say, I think that's a good idea, but it's your choice, your life. What would you want me to do? Doesn't matter what I want. This isn't about me. But if it did matter, if I asked your opinion? He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes serious. I'd want you to stay. Not for me, but for you, because I think you're stronger than you know, and I think if you give yourself a real chance to heal, you might find something worth living for again. And if I don't, then at least you tried. And trying is better than giving up. The conversation stayed with Mara as the weeks continued to pass. She thought about it while kneading bread, while mending clothes, while lying awake in the bedroom listening to the wind. What did she want? She'd been so focused on surviving day to day that she hadn't let herself think beyond the immediate future. The answer, when it came, wasn't dramatic or profound. It came one morning when she woke up and realized she'd slept through the whole night without nightmares. Came when she laughed at something Ben said and realized it was the first time she'd laughed in months. Came when she caught herself planning a garden for spring and realized she was thinking in terms of future instead of just the next few hours. She didn't want to leave. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The thought terrified her. It felt like another betrayal, another broken promise to Thomas. But beneath the terror was something else. Something small and fragile, but undeniably real. Hope. The beginning of it, anyway. Mara was still afraid, still grieving, still carrying wounds that might never fully heal. But she was also alive, and learning to want to be alive, and that was more than she'd had in a long time. So when Caleb asked her one evening if she'd thought any more about spring, she told him the truth. "I want to stay, if the offer's still open." He nodded, no surprise in his expression. "It's open, for as long as you need it." "What if that's years?" "Then it's years." He met her eyes. "I meant what I said, Mara. You're not a burden. You're help I need, and company I—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider. "Company that makes this place feel less empty." It was the most personal thing he'd said to her since the night in her cabin when they'd first shared their stories. Mara felt something shift between them, some invisible boundary becoming a little less rigid. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything, for finding me, for giving me this chance, for not giving up on me when I was giving up on myself. We don't give up on each other, that's the deal." And in that moment, sitting in the warm cabin with the fire crackling and the winter wind howling outside, Mara understood that she'd found something she hadn't been looking for, a partnership forged not in romance or desire, but in shared survival and mutual respect. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was a life she could live. And for now, that was enough. Spring arrived slowly, grudgingly, like it didn't quite trust the land to receive it. The snow began to retreat in patches, revealing brown grass and muddy earth that steamed in the weak sunlight. Icicles dripped from the barn roof in a steady rhythm that Mara found herself listening to during the long afternoons. The cattle, lean from the hard winter, moved more freely in the expanding pastures. And with the thaw came work, relentless, backbreaking work that consumed every waking hour. Calving season started in late March, with a difficult birth that required all four of them working through the night. Mara held the lantern while Caleb and James worked to turn the calf, their arms buried to the shoulders in the laboring cow. Ben kept the anxious herd calm, speaking low words that seemed to settle the animals more than any shouting could. When the calf finally came, wet and steaming and alive, Mara felt something crack open in her chest. New life, improbable and stubborn, arriving despite everything the winter had thrown at them. "You did good," Caleb said to the exhausted cow, running his hand along her flank. Then he looked at Mara. "You too. Not many people can watch that without getting sick." "I've seen worse." The words came out before she could stop them, and she saw understanding flash in Caleb's eyes. Yes, she'd seen worse. Had held her husband while he died slowly, his body broken beyond repair. A cow giving birth was painful but natural, life instead of death. The calf struggled to its feet on wobbly legs, and its mother immediately began licking it clean with single-minded devotion. Within an hour, the calf was nursing, and the crisis was over. But it was only the first of many. Over the next 3 weeks, 17 more calves were born. Most came easy, but 4 required intervention. 1 cow died despite their best efforts, and they lost 2 calves to the cold nights that still came with vicious unpredictability. Mara worked alongside the men during those weeks, learning by doing because there was no time for careful instruction. She learned to read the signs of imminent labor, to assist with difficult births, to warm chilled calves by the stove in the cabin. Her hands, which had been soft when Thomas was alive, became calloused and strong. Her arms ached constantly from hauling water and feed and struggling newborns, but she didn't complain. The work was good, purposeful in a way nothing had been since Thomas died. Each calf that survived felt like a small victory against the wilderness that had tried so hard to destroy her. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, She and Caleb sat on the cabin's front step, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and red. Ben and James had ridden out to check the far pasture, leaving them alone for the first time in weeks. "You've earned your keep 10 times over," Caleb said, rolling his shoulders to work out the stiffness. "Most hired hands don't work half as hard as you do." "I'm not most hired hands." Mara flexed her sore fingers. "And I owe you more than I can ever repay." "You don't owe me anything. We had a deal, work for shelter and food. You've held up your end." "It feels like more than that, though." She looked at him, at his weathered profile against the fading light. "Feels like you gave me back something I'd lost." "What's that?" "A reason to get up in the morning, something to do besides wait to die." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You did the same for me, you know. This place was just going through the motions before you got here. Now it feels like a ranch again instead of a graveyard I happen to live on." The admission hung between them, more intimate than anything they'd shared before. Mara felt her heart beat faster, unsure what to do with the shift in the air. "Caleb," she started, but he stood abruptly. "We should get some sleep. Ben wants to start branding tomorrow, and that's a full day's work minimum." He went inside without waiting for a response, and Mara sat alone on the step, wondering what had just happened. Something had changed between them during the winter. The careful distance they'd maintained was eroding, replaced by something more complex and dangerous. She wasn't sure she was ready for it. Wasn't sure she'd ever be ready. The branding took 3 days of chaos and noise and the acrid smell of burned hair. Mara worked the fire, keeping the irons hot while the men wrestled calves and applied the mark that would identify them as Rourke cattle. It was brutal, efficient work that left everyone exhausted and covered in soot and dirt. On the third night, after the last calf had been branded and released back to its mother, they all collapsed around the cabin's table, too tired to do more than eat the simple stew Mara had made that morning. "I'm getting too old for this," Ben groaned, rubbing his lower back. "Time was I could do 3 days of branding and dance all night after. Now I can barely walk." "You're not old," James said. "You're just out of practice for dancing." "When's the last time any of us danced?" Ben shot back. "Must be 5 years since the last barn dance in these parts." 6, Caleb corrected. "Fall of '81. The Morrison place." "You remember that?" Mara asked, surprised. "Only because it was right before Eleanor." He stopped, shook his head. "Anyway, been a long time." An awkward silence fell. Mara served more stew, giving everyone something to focus on besides the ghosts that had suddenly crowded into the room. "We should have one," James said suddenly. "A dance. Spring celebration. Invite the neighboring ranches." Ben laughed. "And who exactly would organize this grand event? Last I checked, we're 4 people barely keeping this operation running." "We could manage it," James insisted. "Mrs. Whitlock knows how to cook for a crowd. I can play fiddle. Caleb's got the space." "No," Caleb said flatly. "Not interested in having a bunch of strangers tramping through here asking questions." James's eyes flicked to Mara, understanding dawning. "Right. Sorry, boss. Wasn't thinking." But the seed had been planted. Over the next week, as they worked on fence repairs and pasture rotation, the idea kept coming up. Ben mentioned how the Halverson Ranch always used to host spring gatherings. James talked about the music and food he remembered from celebrations on the reservation. Even Caleb, despite his initial refusal, seemed to soften slightly when Ben pointed out how good it would be for morale. Mara stayed quiet during these discussions, unsure of her place. She was still the outsider here, the widow who'd appeared out of nowhere and inserted herself into their lives. The thought of being on display for neighboring ranchers, answering questions about who she was and where she'd come from, made her stomach clench with anxiety. But part of her, a small, stubborn part, wanted it. Wanted to be part of something normal and social and alive instead of constantly hiding from the world. The decision came to a head one afternoon when a rider appeared on the property, a young man on a good horse carrying himself with the confidence of someone who knew he was welcome wherever he went. "That's Matthew Halverson," Ben said, squinting into the distance. "The oldest son. Wonder what brings him out here." What brought him, it turned out, was an invitation. The Halverson family was hosting their annual spring gathering in 2 weeks and wanted to extend a personal invitation to Caleb and his crew. "Father specifically asked me to make sure you knew you were welcome," Matthew said, accepting the coffee Mara offered. He was young, maybe 25, with an easy smile and sharp eyes that cataloged everything about the ranch, including Mara. "Been too long since we've seen you at these things, Rourke?" "Been busy," Caleb said shortly, "and I'm not much for socializing. Come anyway. Good food, good music, good company. Bring your men." His eyes slid to Mara again. "And your housekeeper, of course, if she'd like to attend." The word housekeeper stung, though Mara couldn't say why. It was accurate enough. She did keep the house, along with everything else. But the way Matthew said it, with that slight emphasis, made it sound like something less than what it was. "I'll think about it," Caleb said, standing to indicate the conversation was over. After Matthew left, Caleb found Mara in the kitchen furiously scrubbing pots that were already clean. "You don't have to go," he said, "to the gathering. I know it makes you uncomfortable." "I didn't say I was uncomfortable. You didn't have to. I can see it." He leaned against the doorframe. "But if you want to go, we'll go. All of us together. Nobody'll give you trouble with me and the boys there." Mara set down the pot she'd been scrubbing. "Why would anyone give me trouble?" "Because you're a woman living on a ranch with 3 men, and people talk. Especially people like the Halversons who've got nothing better to do than gossip about their neighbors." His jaw tightened. "I knew it was a risk bringing you here. Knew what people would assume. But I figured your life was worth more than reputation." "It is." Mara dried her hands on her apron. "And I don't care what people think. Let them talk." "You say that now, but talk can be vicious, especially toward women. I survived 3 months alone in a collapsing cabin, Caleb. I think I can survive some wagging tongues." She looked at him directly. "Besides, what are they going to say that's worse than the truth? That I was half dead and you saved me? That I had nowhere else to go? None of that's shameful." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Respect, maybe, or relief. "You want to go then?" "I want to stop hiding. Want to prove to myself that I can be around people without falling apart." She paused. "And maybe I want to show this Matthew Halverson that I'm more than just a housekeeper." Caleb's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "He got under your skin, did he?" "He looked at me like I was something he could acquire if he wanted to. I didn't care for it." "Matthew looks at everything that way. It's how he was raised, thinking the world exists for his taking." Caleb pushed off from the doorframe. "We'll go to the gathering, all of us, and if anyone gives you trouble, they'll answer to me." The 2 weeks before the gathering passed in a blur of preparation. The ranch needed constant attention. Fences that had been put off all winter suddenly became urgent. The chicken coop required repairs after a coyote attack. The vegetable garden Mara had planned needed to be planted while the weather held. But in the evenings, after the work was done, Mara found herself thinking about the gathering with a mixture of dread and anticipation. She had one decent dress, brought from her old cabin in the small bag of possessions she'd carried. It was simple calico, worn but clean, and when she tried it on for the first time in months, she barely recognized the woman in the mirror. The gaunt, haunted creature who'd opened her cabin door to Caleb in December was gone. In her place was someone stronger, tanned from work outdoors, with muscle in her arms and shoulders from hauling water and feed. Her eyes, which had been dead and empty, held something resembling life again. She wasn't the woman she'd been when Thomas was alive, but she wasn't the woman who'd been dying alone either. She was something new, forged in the crucible of grief and survival and hard labor. The morning of the gathering, the ranch was in controlled chaos. Ben and James cleaned up as best they could, trimming beards and putting on their least worn shirts. Caleb disappeared into the bedroom for longer than seemed necessary, emerging in clothes Mara had never seen him wear, actual trousers instead of work dungarees, a shirt without patches, a vest that had seen better days but was still presentable. He looked uncomfortable, like a wolf forced into a collar. "You look nice," Mara said, and immediately felt stupid for saying it. "I look like I'm going to a funeral," Caleb muttered, tugging at the vest. "Hate these things." "Then why are we going?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because you need to stop hiding, and so do I." They rode out mid-morning, all 4 of them on horseback now that Mara had learned to ride during the spring work. The journey to the Halverson Ranch took 2 hours through country that was beginning to green up, wildflowers dotting the hills with spots of color. Other riders joined them on the road. Neighboring ranchers and their families, all heading to the same destination. Mara felt their curious stares, heard the whispers that followed in their wake. But with Caleb riding beside her and Ben and James flanking them like guards, she kept her head up and her eyes forward. The Halverson Ranch was impressive, a sprawling complex of buildings that spoke of money and success. The main house was 2 stories, painted white, with a wraparound porch already filled with people. Behind it, a barn had been cleared and decorated for dancing, and long tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in attendance. "Show-offs," Ben muttered as they dismounted. "Nobody needs a house that big." "Their spread's 3 times the size of ours," James pointed out. "They can afford to show off." Caleb said nothing, but Mara could feel the tension radiating from him. This wasn't his world, and he was as uncomfortable here as she was. Matthew Halverson appeared almost immediately, playing the perfect host. "Rourke, glad you could make it. And Mrs. Whitlock, you look lovely." His smile was practiced, charming. "Let me introduce you around." Before Mara could protest, she found herself being steered toward a group of women clustered near the food tables. They turned to assess her with the kind of casual cruelty that women could deliver without saying a word, taking in her worn dress, her work-roughened hands, her too thin frame that hadn't quite recovered from months of near starvation. "Ladies, this is Mrs. Whitlock. She's been helping Caleb Rourke out at his place this winter. Mrs. Whitlock, this is my mother, Mrs. Halverson, and these are some of our neighbors. Mrs. Halverson was a handsome woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a sharper smile. "How kind of you to help Mr. Rourke. He's been alone out there for so long, it's good to know someone's looking after him." The words were pleasant enough, but the tone suggested something else entirely. Mara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "Mr. Rourke doesn't need looking after. He runs a fine ranch." "Oh, I'm sure he does, though I imagine it's difficult for a man alone." "Mrs." Halverson's gaze swept over Mara again. "You're a widow, I understand." "I am." "How tragic, and how fortunate that you found work so quickly. Not every widow is so lucky." The implication was clear, that Mara was lucky Caleb had taken her in, that she should be grateful, that she was somehow less than the other women here because she'd needed help to survive. Mara felt anger flare hot and bright. "I'd hardly call surviving the winter lucky, Mrs. Halverson, but I suppose we all have different standards." A small, shocked silence fell. Mrs. Halverson's smile froze. Before the situation could escalate, another woman stepped forward, younger, maybe Mara's age, with kind eyes and an open face. "I'm Sarah Chen. My husband and I run the spread east of here. Don't mind Mrs. Halverson, she's just protective of the local bachelors." The comment was delivered with a smile that took some of the sting out of the earlier exchange. "I see." Mara accepted Sarah's offered hand gratefully. "Come on, let me show you where the real food is. These ladies can stand here looking pretty, but I'm hungry." Sarah steered Mara away from the group, lowering her voice. "Don't let them get to you. They're just jealous that Caleb Rourke finally has a woman around. Half of them have been trying to marry him off for years." We're not, Mara stumbled over the words. "I know, but they don't know that, and honestly, it's none of their business anyway." Sarah handed her a plate. "Eat something. You look like you could use a good meal." Over the next hour, Sarah became an unexpected ally, introducing Mara to the friendlier families and running interference with the more judgmental ones. She was easy to talk to, with a straightforward manner that reminded Mara of what she'd once been like, before grief had complicated everything. "How long have you been out here?" Mara asked as they watched the crowd grow. 5 years. Came out from San Francisco with my husband after the market crashed and we lost everything. Figured we couldn't do worse starting over in Montana." Sarah laughed. "Turns out we were wrong about that. But we're still here and the ranch is still standing, so I guess we're doing something right." "Do you ever regret it, coming out here?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "Every winter. But then spring comes and I remember why we stayed. There's something about this land. It's brutal and beautiful, and it doesn't care about your past or your mistakes. Just cares whether you're strong enough to survive it." Mara thought about her own journey, the cabin she'd left behind, the grave she couldn't visit. "I think I understand that." "I think you do." Sarah squeezed her arm. "And for what it's worth, I think you're doing just fine, better than most would in your situation." As the afternoon wore into evening, the gathering shifted from polite socializing to actual celebration. Someone brought out a fiddle, and James joined them with his own instrument. The music started slow and sweet, then built into something livelier that had people moving toward the barn for dancing. Mara hung back, content to watch from the sidelines. She'd never been much of a dancer even before, and now the thought of being touched by strangers made her skin crawl. But Caleb found her anyway, appearing at her elbow with 2 cups of punch. "You surviving?" "Barely. These people are exhausting." "Tell me about it." He handed her a cup. "Want to leave?" "Do you?" "Asked you first." Mara looked around at the celebration, the music and laughter, the children running wild, the couples dancing with the easy intimacy of long partnership. It hurt to watch, reminded her of everything she'd lost. But it also reminded her that life continued, that joy still existed in the world, even when grief seemed all-consuming. "Not yet," she said. "I think I need to see this through." Caleb nodded, understanding without needing more explanation. They stood together on the edge of the crowd, not quite part of it, but no longer completely separate either. Then Matthew Halverson appeared, offering his hand to Mara with that practiced charm. "Mrs. Whitlock, would you do me the honor of a dance?" Every instinct screamed at her to refuse. But Caleb was watching, and so was half the gathering, and something stubborn in Mara refused to be the widow who couldn't even manage a simple dance. "All right," she heard herself say. Matthew led her onto the floor with the confidence of someone who'd never been refused anything. His hand on her waist was too familiar, too possessive, and Mara had to fight the urge to pull away. "You're quite the mystery, Mrs. Whitlock," he said as they moved through the steps. "Appearing out of nowhere to work for the most reclusive rancher in the territory." "There's no mystery. I needed work. Mr. Rourke offered it. And that's all? Forgive me, but that seems like quite a simplified version of events." "It's the truth." Mara met his eyes directly. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Nothing at all." But his smile suggested otherwise. "Just seems unusual for a man like Rourke to suddenly take on a housekeeper. He's turned down help for years." Perhaps he finally realized he needed it. Perhaps. Matthew pulled her slightly closer. Or perhaps there's more to the story than either of you are saying. Mara stopped dancing, pulling out of his grip. "Thank you for the dance, Mr. Halverson, but I think I'm done now." She walked off the floor with as much dignity as she could manage, feeling his eyes on her back and hearing the whispers start up again. Her hands were shaking with anger and something close to shame, though she'd done nothing wrong. Caleb met her at the edge of the barn. "What did he say?" "Nothing that matters." Mara wrapped her arms around herself. "Can we leave now?" "Yeah, we can leave." They collected Ben and James and rode back to the ranch in silence, the celebration fading behind them. Mara felt like she'd failed some test she hadn't known she was taking, had wanted to prove she could handle society again, but instead had just confirmed what everyone already thought, that she was damaged, broken, not fit for normal life. Back at the ranch, while Ben and James headed to the barn, Caleb stopped Mara before she could escape to the bedroom. "What Matthew said, don't let it get to you. He's just posturing because he's threatened." "Threatened by what? I'm nobody." "You're a woman who didn't fall for his charm. That's enough." Caleb's expression was serious. "And you're not nobody, Mara. You're someone who survived what would have killed most people. That matters." "Does it?" Mara felt the tears she'd been holding back start to surface. "Because right now it feels like I'm just this broken thing that doesn't fit anywhere. Not with Thomas anymore, not in the world I came from, not even here where I'm supposed to be rebuilding." "You do fit here." Caleb took a step closer. "You fit here better than anywhere else you could be. This ranch runs better with you on it. The men are happier. He stopped, seemed to struggle with the words. "I'm better with you here too." The admission hung between them, charged with meaning neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. Mara looked up at him, at this man who'd saved her life and asked nothing in return, who'd given her shelter and work and something resembling purpose. "I don't know what we're doing here," she whispered. "I don't know what this is becoming." "Neither do I, but whatever it is, we don't have to figure it out tonight." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was gentle, almost tender. "Just know that you belong here, Mara. For as long as you want to stay." She wanted to believe him, wanted to feel like she belonged somewhere again, but the grief and guilt were still there, still whispering that she had no right to happiness or belonging or anything except the slow fade she'd been doing before Caleb knocked on her door. "I should get some sleep," she said, stepping back from his touch. He let her go without argument, and Mara retreated to the bedroom feeling more confused than ever. Through the door, she could hear Caleb moving around the cabin, banking the fire, settling in for the night. And for the first time since Thomas died, Mara let herself wonder, not if she could survive, but if she could actually live again. If she could let herself want something beyond just making it through another day. The answer terrified her. But it was there, small and persistent, taking root despite all her efforts to kill it. Hope. Real, dangerous, impossible hope. The weeks following the gathering brought a subtle shift to the ranch that Mara couldn't quite name. The work continued as it always had, endless and demanding, but something in the air between her and Caleb had changed. They were more careful with each other now, like two people navigating around something fragile they weren't ready to acknowledge. May arrived with warm winds and the promise of real summer. The calves were thriving, the cattle spread across the greening pastures like dark patches on a quilt. Mara's garden began to sprout, neat rows of vegetables that she tended each morning before the day's heat became unbearable. She was kneeling among the bean plants one morning when she heard a horse approach. Looking up, she saw Sarah Chen dismounting with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. "Hope I'm not intruding," Sarah called out. "Brought you some tomato starts from my greenhouse. Figured you could use them." Mara stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "You didn't have to ride all this way." "Needed an excuse to get away from my own ranch for a few hours. My husband's driving me crazy with his plans to expand the herd." Sarah handed over a wooden crate filled with small plants. "Besides, I wanted to check on you after the gathering. Matthew Halverson can be a real piece of work. He certainly has opinions about things that aren't his business." "That's one way to put it," Sarah laughed. "The other way is that he's an entitled jackass who thinks every woman in the territory should be grateful for his attention. Don't let him get under your skin." They planted the tomatoes together, Sarah offering advice on spacing and watering while they worked. It felt good to have another woman around, someone who understood the peculiar isolation of frontier life without needing it explained. "Can I ask you something personal?" Sarah said after a while. Mara tensed. "You can ask." "What happened to your husband? I heard bits and pieces, but people love to embellish." The question should have hurt, but Sarah's tone was gentle, genuinely curious rather than prying. Mara found herself answering honestly. "Logging accident. A chain snapped and the logs rolled onto him. He lived for 3 hours after I found him." Sarah's hand stilled in the dirt. "I'm so sorry." "Everyone's sorry, but sorry doesn't change anything." Mara patted soil around a tomato plant with more force than necessary. "He made me promise to leave Montana, to go back east to my sister. Instead, I stayed in our cabin and nearly starved to death until Caleb found me. And now you're here." "Now I'm here." Mara sat back on her heels, trying to figure out if I'm rebuilding a life or just running from the one I couldn't save. Sarah considered this carefully. "Can it be both? When my husband and I lost everything in San Francisco, we came out here partly to rebuild and partly because we couldn't stand to stay where we'd failed. I think maybe that's how most people end up in places like this, running towards something and away from something at the same time." Does it get easier, knowing you left everything behind?" "Some days. Other days I wake up and wonder what I was thinking, choosing this hard life when I could have stayed in the city and found easier work." Sarah smiled. "But then I remember that easy isn't always better, and sometimes the hard things are the ones worth doing." They worked in companionable silence after that, finishing the planting as the sun climbed higher. When Sarah finally mounted her horse to leave, she paused and looked down at Mara with serious eyes. "Whatever's developing between you and Caleb Rourke, and don't tell me there's nothing, I saw how he looked at you at the gathering. Don't let guilt stop you from being happy. Your husband's gone, Mara. You're not. And you deserve to have a life that's more than just survival." Before Mara could respond, Sarah had kicked her horse into a trot and was riding away, leaving Mara standing among her new tomato plants with her heart pounding and her mind racing. That evening, Mara found herself watching Caleb more closely than usual. The way he moved through the cabin with quiet competence, The way his hands looked when he worked on mending a bridle. The way his eyes softened when he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She'd been so focused on surviving, on getting through each day without breaking, that she hadn't let herself think about what came after survival. Hadn't let herself want anything beyond the next meal, the next night's sleep, the next small task that needed doing. But Sarah was right. Something was developing between them, had been developing since that first night when he'd kept watch while she slept. It was built on shared grief and mutual respect, and the bone-deep understanding that came from two people who'd both stood on the edge of giving up. The question was whether she had the courage to acknowledge it. June brought the kind of heat that made work before dawn and after dusk the only bearable option. The cattle sought shade during the worst of the afternoon hours, and even the horses moved slowly, conserving energy. Mara spent the hottest parts of the day inside, working on the ranch's books that Caleb had finally admitted were a disaster. She discovered she had a talent for numbers, for seeing patterns in the chaos of expenses and income. Within a week, she'd reorganized the entire system, creating ledgers that actually made sense. Within 2 weeks, she'd identified several areas where they were losing money unnecessarily. "You're wasted on cooking and cleaning," Caleb said one evening, reviewing her work. "This is better than anything I could have done." "I like it. Makes me feel useful in a different way." Mara pointed to a column of figures. "You're paying too much for feed. I checked the prices from 3 different suppliers, and Morrison's is charging you nearly 20% more than the others." "I've been buying from Morrison for years." "Which is probably why he thinks he can overcharge you. Switch suppliers and you'll save enough in a year to hire another hand if you need one." Caleb studied the numbers, then looked at her with something close to admiration. "Where'd you learn to do this?" "My father was a bookkeeper in Philadelphia before he died. He taught me when I was young, said every woman should know how to manage money, even if society didn't think she needed to." Mara felt a pang of nostalgia for the stern, practical man who'd raised her in the orphanage before succumbing to fever. "Thomas never wanted me touching the finances. Said it wasn't woman's work." "Thomas was wrong about a lot of things, seems like." The comment was mild, but it held weight. Mara had spent months defending Thomas in her mind, romanticizing their marriage, convincing herself it had been perfect before the accident destroyed everything. But the truth was more complicated. Thomas had loved her, but he'd also dismissed her, ignored her advice, made decisions without consulting her. He'd dragged her to Montana chasing dreams he never quite achieved, then died and left her with nothing. She'd loved him despite his flaws, but she didn't have to pretend he'd been perfect. "He was a good man," she said carefully. "But yes, he was wrong about some things." Caleb nodded, not pushing further. "Well, I'm not wrong about this. You've just saved this ranch more money than I could have managed in 5 years. That's worth celebrating." "Celebrating how?" He thought for a moment. "There's a spot about an hour's ride from here, up in the high meadow. Prettiest view in the territory. I could pack some food. We could go tomorrow evening after the heat breaks, just the two of us." Mara's pulse quickened. It wasn't quite a courting invitation, too practical for that, too casual. But it wasn't just ranch business either. It was something in between, something undefined that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "What about Ben and James?" "They can manage one evening without us. Might even be grateful for the peace and quiet." She should say no. Should maintain the careful distance they'd been keeping. Should remember that it had only been 6 months since Thomas died. That people would talk. That she wasn't ready for whatever this was becoming. But she was tired of should, tired of living according to rules that had stopped making sense. "All right," she heard herself say. "Tomorrow evening." The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Mara tried to focus on her usual tasks, but found herself constantly distracted, wondering what she'd agreed to, what it meant, whether she was making a terrible mistake. Ben noticed. "You all right, Mrs. Whitlock? You've been jumpier than a cat all day." "I'm fine, just warm." "Warm." Ben's knowing look suggested he didn't believe her for a second. "Sure, that's what it is." By the time evening arrived, Mara had changed her dress 3 times and rebraided her hair twice. She felt ridiculous, like a girl preparing for her first dance instead of a widow going on a simple ride with her employer. Except Caleb wasn't just her employer anymore. She wasn't sure what he was, but it was more than that. He was waiting by the horses when she emerged from the cabin, and the look on his face when he saw her made her breath catch. It wasn't the practiced charm Matthew Halverson had used, or even the comfortable familiarity of marriage. It was something rawer, more uncertain, like he was seeing her clearly for the first time and was surprised by what he found. "You look nice," he said simply. "So do you." They rode out as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The high meadow Caleb had mentioned was everything he'd promised. A sweep of grass dotted with wildflowers, surrounded by pine trees, with a view that stretched for miles across the valley below. "I come up here sometimes when I need to think," Caleb said, dismounting and helping Mara down. "Especially in the years right after Eleanor died. Felt like the only place I could breathe." So they spread a blanket and unpacked the simple meal he'd brought: bread, cheese, dried apples, a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving. As the sun set and the stars began to emerge, they ate and talked about everything and nothing: the ranch, their pasts, their fears, their tentative hopes for the future. "I never thought I'd get here," Mara admitted, lying back on the blanket to watch the stars emerge. 6 months ago, I was ready to die. Wanted to, even. And now I'm lying under the stars eating cheese and feeling almost happy. It doesn't make sense." "Grief never makes sense. Neither does healing." Caleb lay down beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "But I know what you mean. For years I thought I'd just go through the motions until I died. Then you showed up and everything changed." "How did it change?" "The ranch stopped feeling like a grave I was tending. Started feeling like a place where something could actually grow." He turned his head to look at her. "You did that, Mara. Just by being here, by surviving, by refusing to give up even when giving up would have been easier." "I did give up. You found me after I'd already surrendered. But you opened the door. That's the part that matters. You could have left me standing in the storm, but you didn't. You chose to let someone in, even when you had every reason not to." Mara felt tears prick her eyes. "I was so scared. Still am, most days." "Me too." Caleb's hand found hers in the darkness, their fingers intertwining naturally. "But maybe being scared together is better than being scared alone." They lay like that for a long time, holding hands under the stars, not speaking because words felt insufficient for what was passing between them. It wasn't the desperate passion of young love or the comfortable intimacy of long marriage. It was something forged in shared pain and mutual survival, something that had grown slowly and carefully in the spaces between grief and hope. Finally, Mara turned on her side to face him. "I need to tell you something." "All right." "I'm not ready to let go of Thomas, not completely. Part of me still loves him, still mourns him, probably always will." She squeezed his hand. "But another part of me is ready to stop dying with him, ready to have a life that's mine instead of just the shadow of what we had together." Caleb met her eyes steadily. "I'm not asking you to forget him or stop loving him. Eleanor's still part of me too, probably always will be. But that doesn't mean we can't build something new, something that honors what we lost while still letting us live." "Is that what you want? To build something with me?" "Yes." No hesitation, no doubt. "If you'll have me." Mara's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. This was the moment, the choice that would determine everything that came after. She could pull back, maintain the safe distance of employer and employee, protect herself from the risk of more loss and pain, or she could choose to live, really live, with all the danger and possibility that entailed. "I'll have you," she whispered, "but I need time, need to figure out who I am now before I can figure out who we are together." "We've got time, all the time you need." Caleb brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I'm not going anywhere, Mara. This is my home, and if you'll let it be yours too, then we'll figure out the rest as we go." They rode back to the ranch in the darkness, closer than they'd ridden before, shoulders touching, hands occasionally brushing. When they arrived, Ben and James were conspicuously absent, having made themselves scarce in a way that suggested they knew exactly what was happening and approved. At the cabin door, Caleb turned to Mara one last time. "No expectations," he said quietly. "We go at whatever pace feels right. And if that pace is slow, then it's slow. I can wait." Mara stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. Brief, chaste, but full of promise. "Thank you. For everything. For finding me, for saving me, for giving me a reason to want to be saved." She went to bed that night feeling lighter than she had in months. The guilt was still there, would probably always be there in some form. But it was joined now by something else. Hope, yes, but also determination. The fierce resolve to build a life that mattered, that honored her survival, that proved her pain hadn't been for nothing. The summer passed in a blur of work and slow courtship. Caleb didn't push, didn't demand more than she was ready to give. They worked side by side during the day, ate meals together in the evenings, talked long into the night about everything from philosophy to cattle breeding. Sometimes he'd take her hand or she'd lean against his shoulder, small gestures of affection that felt monumental after so long alone. Word spread, of course. Matthew Halverson made a point of riding by the ranch one afternoon with a smirk that said he'd suspected all along. Mrs. Halverson sent a thinly veiled letter suggesting that perhaps Mara might want to observe a more appropriate mourning period. Sarah Chen sent a note that said simply, "Good for you," and a basket of fresh bread. Mara discovered she didn't care what most people thought. The ones who mattered, Sarah, Ben, James, and most importantly Caleb, supported her. The rest could gossip all they wanted. She'd survived worse than wagging tongues. In late August, Caleb asked her to marry him, not with flowery speeches or grand gestures, but during morning coffee while they reviewed the ranch accounts together. "I think we should make this official," he said, tapping the ledger with his pencil. "For legal reasons, if nothing else. If something happens to me, I want the ranch to go to you, not some distant cousin who's never set foot in Montana." Mara looked up from the numbers she'd been calculating. "That's the most unromantic proposal I've ever heard." "I know, but it's honest." He set down the pencil and took her hand. "I love you, Mara. Not the same way I loved Eleanor, and I'm guessing not the same way you loved Thomas, but it's real and it's strong, and I want to spend whatever time I've got left making sure you never have to face another winter alone." "I love you too." The words felt strange in her mouth, like a language she'd almost forgotten. "But are we doing this too fast? It's only been 8 months since you chose to live instead of die. Since we found each other in the middle of our respective hells and decided to climb out together." Caleb squeezed her hand. "I don't care what's proper or what people think the timeline should be. I care about you, and I want to build a life with you. Everything else is just noise." Mara thought about Thomas, about the grave she'd left behind, about the woman she'd been who'd made those promises to a dying man. That woman was gone, transformed by grief and survival into someone new, someone stronger, harder, more certain of what she wanted. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." They married in September, a small ceremony with just Ben and James as witnesses and Sarah Chen standing up as Mara's only attendant. No fancy dress, no elaborate celebration, just two people making vows to each other in front of the people who mattered. Mara wore her calico dress and wildflowers in her hair. Caleb wore his good vest and looked uncomfortable but happy. When they exchanged rings, simple bands they'd ordered from the catalog, Mara felt Thomas's ghost finally release its hold on her. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but no longer the anchor dragging her down into darkness. That night, in the bedroom that was now truly theirs, Caleb held her close and whispered against her hair. "No regrets?" "Some, but not about this, never about this." That's all I needed to hear. They built their life together slowly, carefully, with the patience of people who'd learned that nothing worth having came easy. The ranch thrived under their combined effort. Caleb's experience and Mara's organizational skills creating something more successful than either could have managed alone. They lost cattle to harsh winters and drought summers, lost crops to late frosts and early snows, lost bets on futures markets and investments that didn't pan out. But they survived it all, leaning on each other through the hard times, celebrating together through the good. In the spring of 1889, Mara discovered she was pregnant. The news terrified her. She was 33 years old, past the age when childbirth was safest, and she couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor, about all the women who died bringing life into the world. But Caleb was there through every moment of fear, every wave of morning sickness, every night when she couldn't sleep for worrying. And when their daughter was born in December, screaming and healthy and perfect, Mara understood for the first time that joy and grief could coexist, that new love didn't erase old loss but made it bearable. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, because she belonged only to the future they were building together. More children followed, 2 sons in quick succession, then another daughter who arrived when Mara was 40, and everyone said she was too old. The ranch house expanded to accommodate the growing family. Rooms added one at a time as they could afford the materials and labor. Ben and James stayed on for years, becoming uncles to the children, teaching them to ride and rope and survive in the hard territory that was their birthright. Eventually, Ben retired to live with a sister in Oregon, and James married a Blackfeet woman from the reservation and started his own small ranch nearby. The Halverson family faded into irrelevance as younger, more progressive families moved into the territory. Matthew never did find a woman willing to put up with his arrogance and eventually left Montana for business opportunities back east. Sarah and her husband became lifelong friends, their children growing up together with the Rourke kids. Through it all, Mara kept the small bag of Thomas's possessions tucked away in a trunk in the bedroom. Once a year, on the anniversary of his death, she'd take them out and remember the man who'd brought her to Montana, the life they'd tried to build, the dreams that had died with him. Caleb never questioned this ritual, understanding that honoring the past didn't threaten the present. Years turned into decades. The frontier gradually tamed, though it never lost its edge. Barbed wire replaced open range. The railroad pushed farther north. Towns grew into cities. Montana became a state. Through it all, the ranch endured. Not because it was easy, it was never easy, but because Mara and Caleb had learned the fundamental truth of survival. That strength wasn't about never breaking, but about choosing to rebuild every time you did. In the spring of 1907, at the age of 65, Caleb died peacefully in his sleep, worn out from a lifetime of hard work, but satisfied with what he'd built. Mara buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, next to the plot she'd already picked out for herself. She lived another 12 years, watching her children take over the ranch operations, watching grandchildren arrive and grow. She taught her daughters to keep books and her sons to respect the women they married. She became known throughout the territory as a formidable woman who'd survived everything Montana could throw at her and come out stronger. When people asked about her past, and they always asked eventually, she told them the truth. About Thomas and the cabin and the winter she'd almost died. About Caleb appearing in a storm and offering a different path. About the choice she'd made to live instead of surrender. Wasn't easy, she'd say, her voice still strong even as her body weakened with age. Still isn't some days, but I learned something important in that cabin during the worst winter of my life. That survival is a choice you make every single day. And if you're lucky, if you're very lucky, you eventually find something worth surviving for. In the spring of 1919, Mara Whitlock Rourke died surrounded by her children and grandchildren in the ranch house she'd helped build, on the land she'd learned to love. She was buried next to Caleb on that hill, their graves marked with simple stones that faced the mountains. And if late at night, when the wind blew cold across the Montana territory, anyone had been listening, they might have heard the echo of an old story, of a woman who'd been dying alone and a man who'd knocked on her door, and the impossible, improbable life they'd forged together in the hard territory where only the strongest survived. It wasn't a fairy tale. There was no magic, no miracle, no divine intervention. Just 2 broken people who'd chosen to be broken together, and in that choosing had found something close to redemption. The ranch still stands today, passed down through generations who carry the story in their blood. The original cabin where Caleb found Mara has long since collapsed, reclaimed by the wilderness. Thomas's grave has been lost to time, the wooden cross rotted away, the exact location forgotten. But the life Mara built, the life she chose when she opened that door, that endures. In the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who worked the land, in the strength they inherited from a woman who refused to give up. In the story that gets told and retold, changing slightly with each telling but always carrying the same essential truth. That survival is a choice, that grief doesn't have to be the end, that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are doorways to something we never could have imagined, and that love, when it comes the second time, isn't less real for being different. It's just different. Built on different foundations, serving different needs, creating different joys. Mara Whitlock came to Montana as one woman and died as another, transformed by loss and survival and the hard work of rebuilding. Her story isn't unique. The frontier was full of women who survived impossible circumstances, who buried husbands and children, who kept going when giving up would have been easier. But it's hers. And she lived it on her own terms, making choices that were hers alone, building a life that mattered because she decided it would. In the end, that's all any of us can do. Choose to open the door when opportunity knocks. Choose to keep breathing when breathing feels impossible. Choose to build something new from the ashes of what we've lost. Mara chose. And in that choice, she found not just survival, but something worth surviving for. A man who understood her grief because he carried his own. Children who never knew how close they came to not existing. A ranch that prospered because two people who should have died instead chose to live. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the life she built, piece by piece, day by day, choice by choice. And in the end, that made it hers. Completely, undeniably, triumphantly hers. The Montana wind still blows cold across that territory, still tests everyone who tries to make a home there. But somewhere in its howling, if you listen carefully, you can hear the echo of a woman who faced that wind and didn't break, who opened her door to a stranger in a storm and found salvation, who learned that the hardest thing we ever do is choose to keep living when everything inside us wants to stop. Who built a legacy not in spite of her brokenness, but because of it? That was Mara. That is her story. And it ends not with death, but with the life that came after. The impossible, beautiful, hard-won life that proved survival was just the beginning.